Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Productive Conflict Masterclass today. This is part of our On Purpose Masterclass series and part of the Productive Conflict launch that we've got going on right now. So thank you all for joining me. Very excited to be on this masterclass with you today. And just a logistical note, I've got you on mute. If you've got a question or thought, please unmute yourself and please go ahead and jump in. I'll also have a Q&A toward the end of our conversation today. So thanks again for joining us. My intent today is to share some information about how you and your team can transform destructive conflict to productive conflict so that ultimately you can move faster, be more innovative as a person, a team, an organization, and frankly, just create a great place to work. And so as we go through this process today, here's our path forward. We're going to talk about the cost of conflict in today's workplace. We'll talk about the distinction between conflict resolution and productive conflict. Talk about building individual productive conflict capacity. And then finally, we'll talk about and really focus on that capacity, but I'll also make a special offer at the end of our conversation today about some of the offerings that we've got related to productive conflict. So as you go through this conversation today, here's the foundational question that I want you to challenge yourself around and ask yourself. How can we transform destructive conflict to productive conflict in our organization so that we can drive faster business results? And when you think about the word conflict, what's the first thing that comes to mind for you? Feel free to go ahead and insert some of your thoughts and words, reactions, feelings into your chat box. But what's the first thing that comes to mind when you think about that word conflict, especially when it relates to the workplace? Put some of those words in your chat box to get the conversation started today. Here's some words that come to mind for me or others as we think about conflict in the workplace and we see people engaged in conflict in the workplace in our executive coaching engagements. You've seen the destructive outcomes of negative conflict. And we tend to think about conflict on a continua. So imagine on one end of the continua, there's aggressive behavior. And imagine on the other end of the continua, there's passive behavior. They're both equally destructive. And you know what the results are. People nod their heads in agreement during meetings. They then leave the meeting, and they have the meeting after the meeting. Decisions get revisited over and over again. And it takes a long time to get committed around a direction or around a decision. And when we engage in unproductive conflict, it is really difficult to keep pace with the rapid change, rapid innovation, and disruption that's coming from, I would say, unexpected competitors in this marketplace. Maybe that's one of the biggest differences about our work environment today. I mean, take Amazon as an example. 2 years ago, would you ever have thought that Amazon would be competing in the food industry, or maybe even giving organizations like UPS and FedEx a run for their money? So my question is, how much time do you spend on conflict in the workplace? How much energy do you spend on blame, gossip, disrespect, some of those words that you just put in the chat box, complaining, not listening, or caving in and withdrawing from conflict? It's an expensive proposition, and you already know this. We all know this. According to the Washington Business Journal, this statistic just really blows my mind. But again, I think it correlates to some of the issues that we see as we're working with leaders in the workplace. The average manager spends 25 to 40% of his or her time dealing with conflict in the workplace. So if you think about that, that's 1 to 2 days a week of a manager's time dealing with gossip, protecting turf, retaliation, recruiting people to one side or another of an argument, planning defenses, navigating the drama. More importantly, though, it's time not spent on answering customer questions, filling orders, not doing the work that we've hired people to do to add value to our businesses. In the US alone, a conservative estimate of people spending just about 3 hours a week at an average salary of $18 an hour on conflict equates to over $359 billion spent on conflict, according to Entrepreneur magazine. Fascinating number. And there's a book called Controlling the Cost of Conflict. So we spend all of this time and money dealing with these destructive behaviors. And the authors of this book say, hey, unproductive conflict is probably the largest reducible cost in many businesses. Fascinating. So it's worth spending time trying to address this issue in the workplace. And for organizations that don't, frankly, they're not going to keep up with the more agile, innovative, and disruptive organizations. They will become extinct. And I can always draw a direct line between ineffective conflict behaviors in the workplace and an impact on business results. Coaching executives. I remember coaching the CEO of a fast-growing tech startup, and part of our coaching revolved around his conflict avoidance tendencies and the direct correlation between those tendencies and product releases that were coming out way too late. Or the COO who is so focused on results and winning, his aggressive approach isolates him in the workplace. And part of the issues that he faces are around people not feeling valued and frankly leaving the organization. Again, we can tie that behavior directly to business results. So as we're going through this process today, part of what I want to create is a distinction around conflict resolution, the traditional way we see how to solve for conflict in the workplace, and productive conflict. So it's not uncommon with a typical conflict resolution approach to not consider individuals. Conflict resolution traditionally is really a process that's used to resolve conflict without confrontation. And with conflict resolution, each side of the conflict makes concessions, and generally they lead to a result that is equally dissatisfying to all parties that are involved. And conflict resolution tends to be kind of a skills-based approach to solving one conflict at a time. And part of what I would argue is that we need to build a deeper capacity in the people that are on our teams, whether it's our leaders, our team members, and others, so that they're not just solving for one point in time issue, but they've got the capacity to deal with conflict and complexity and the chaos in our workplace at a much deeper level. And that's what we refer to when we think about productive conflict. So it's deeper. It allows people to expand their capacity and engage in more situations in the future. So imagine what's possible, right? This is my challenge to you. Imagine what's possible if your organization, your team, the microcosm of where you work could empower its employees to engage in productive conflict. And that's the capacity building really that we want to get into in today's session, to really understand your conflict behaviors so that you can have more productive conflict and engage effectively with other people in the workplace, create healthier, more aligned organizations. So that's where we're headed today. Now, there's multiple ways to look at productive conflict. And at 512 Solutions, part of how we look at productive conflict is really at three layers: the individual layer, the team level, and organizational level. And for the purposes of today's masterclass, we're really going to focus on the individual level. And there's a few reasons for this. First of all, great leaders start there anyway. They look at themselves first to understand how they're contributing to the problem, the challenge, the issue at hand. So we're going to start with the individual level today. We'll have another masterclass on this topic in early September. And in that masterclass, we'll take a look at the team and the organizational level. So today's focus is really going to be on the individual. So as we consider our productive conflict approach, we can look at really two areas, or at least these are the two areas that we're going to look at today. We can look at the past, maybe how we've been brought up, how we've been nurtured, if you will. And we can also look at personality, which is really more about who we are, our nature. You've heard of, is it nurture or is it nature? Well, they both apply certainly when it comes to productive conflict. For now, let's take a look at our past, because I truly believe that it's hard to build awareness around productive conflict without understanding what we bring to the workplace. So for me, I grew up in an Italian Catholic household in the small town of Simsbury, Connecticut, just outside of Hartford. My mom grew up on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Her parents resided in Little Italy. If you've ever spent any time down there, we used to visit 200 Mulberry Street and see all of our aunts and uncles because they all lived in the same building. So imagine this, very traditional upbringing that my mom had in New York City. And we got to very much experience that as kids. And my father also grew up in a traditional Italian household. And the work ethic that was part of his upbringing, we just can't deny that it's influenced how we have, operate and have learned to operate. My father's father was a stonemason, so he worked at a very young age in that business. And my father's father was also a non-recovering alcoholic. So you can imagine the impact that had on my father as he was growing up. So in my household, we dealt with conflict passive aggressively. Things sort of layered underneath the surface, and from time to time they would come out in mostly non-productive ways. And we also grew up in a household where there was a very hierarchical organization or orientation, if you will, where you didn't really challenge your parents or your grandparents or your aunts and uncles. They were authority figures, and so we grew up with that. And so for me personally, I bring all of those experiences into the workplace. And I've had to work on being more productive in conflict. It's taken me concerted energy and time to change those old patterns and behaviors of having a more passive-aggressive approach to conflict and being critical in conflict. So this is the first step. The first step is just a personal look back. How did you grow up? How does it impact your ability and productivity when it comes to engaging in conflict? So many of you have had the opportunity to download our Productive Conflict Toolkit. If you haven't, feel free to do that after the masterclass. If you've got it, you can take a look at the Conflict Toolkit in the first section, the individual section. We're going to talk about some of the questions that are in there. So my first question for you is, what was the conflict environment like in your home growing up? Did your family actively express themselves? Was there spirited debate, or were conversations more sort of swept under the rug and avoided? So that's the first question for you this morning. The second is, where did you grow up? Because that matters as well. The way that people engage in conflict in New York, or I went to school outside of Boston for undergrad. That's very different than how my clients in Minnesota Nice engage in conflict, or the way that you might engage in conflict in the South, right? With a direct and blunt versus amiable and polite. So where did you grow up, and how did that geographical region impact how you engage in conflict today? And then your culture matters, of course. And by the way, there are other factors that have influenced how you engage in conflict, but culture certainly tends to have a pretty big influence as well. Some cultures tend to be expressive and emotional, others more guarded in their approach. What cultural background has influenced you, and how's it shaped how you approach conflict? My wife comes from a Norwegian descendant family, and their tendencies as a family are to be polite, guarded, efficient. And me, from a more Italian background, we tend to be more expressive, more emotional. It's not uncommon to take 30 minutes just to say goodbye to all the family members, or to sit down for Christmas dinner for 4 hours. So very different approach to life, but then also to conflict. So my first question for you is, how has your background influenced you? Take a few moments. We won't spend a lot of time here. Some of these questions you can refer to for field work from our session today, but take a minute to reflect on these 3 questions. What was the conflict environment like in your home? Where'd you grow up? How did that conflict environment impact how you engage in conflict from a geographical region perspective? And then what cultural background has influenced you? And how has it shaped your approach? Take a minute or so just to reflect on those 3 questions. All right. So as we consider our backgrounds and our individual responses to conflict, we've got our past, right? How we have grown up, who's influenced us. And then there's another component to us, which is our personality, if you will, and how we are shaped. The nature of who we are also plays a really big influence in how we engage in conflict. So we're going to explore personality for a fair amount on this masterclass as well today. And I want to introduce you to 4 people. They're all on a project team in the workplace. And I'm going to share their personalities, if you will, or at least some of their tendencies. I want you to think about how this group of 4 people coming together might impact their ability to make decisions, move quickly, and engage in conflict in the workplace. So the first person is Ruby. Ruby is assertive and bold. She focuses on results. She can at times be overly insensitive. She prioritizes control. And so at times that tends to create a win-lose situation in which, of course, she will win. She also prioritizes justification when it comes to conflict. So she may become dismissive of others when things maybe don't go her way or get tense in the workplace. So that's Ruby, and she's the team leader, by the way. Meet Ron. Ron tends to be expressive and outgoing. He is friendly and cooperative, values relationships. He does his best to keep things upbeat. He likes to be liked. He wants to be liked. And he's also expressive. He's willing to share what's on his mind. So you can see some very outgoing behavior from Ron. Susan's a little bit more moderate paced in her approach. She's also very people focused. She's a team player. She values agreement, acceptance. She's patient, loyal. She's a good listener, almost the glue that holds a team together. And in conflict, it's not uncommon for her to let things simmer under the surface. And meet Dave. He's the 4th team member here that we're going to look at today. He tends to be more reserved, analytical. He keeps emotions out of discussions. So you're going to see some more diplomatic behavior from Dave, prefers logical debates and looking at things from an analytical and logical perspective. He prides himself in getting things right, being accurate, and his critical thinking skills. So all of these players, if you will, these team players fall on this model called DISC. Many of you have seen this model or maybe a different personality style model. And it's a way to view human behavior. DISC provides us with a framework to better understand ourselves and our natural responses in conflict. So there's 4 main styles in the DISC model. And by the way, we're all a mix of all 4 styles. None of these styles are right or wrong, better or worse than others. It's ultimately our responsibility as people, as team members, to be effective in conflict and in the workplace. And we can't blame our styles on what happens. It's ultimately a choice. Conflict's inevitable, but it's a choice. But DISC can give us some insight into how we as individuals respond in conflict and how others might respond in conflict. The dominant style tends to be fast-paced and assertive. They value results, getting things done, making quick decisions and challenge. So you're going to see direct, tough-minded, strong-willed, even forceful behaviors. The I style, on the other hand, also believes they can control their environment. They tend to do it more through influence. So you're going to see more outgoing, enthusiastic, optimistic behavior. Sometimes these folks will be seen as sociable, expressive, charming even. The steadiness style in the lower right tends to be more calm and reserved, and they're team players. They are loyal, patient, good listeners. They tend to be more even-tempered and accommodating. And finally, in the lower left-hand side, we've got the conscientiousness style. And the conscientiousness style tends to be more even-keeled. They tend to be more logical in their approach. They value accuracy and analytical. So you're going to see that reserved, precise, and more private behaviors. In conflict, the dominant style tends to focus on logic and victory, and it's not uncommon for them to dismiss the opinions of others. The I style, on the other hand, tends to focus really more on expressiveness and their feelings, their emotions, if you will. And so in conflict, it's not uncommon for you to see an emotional outburst, maybe after initially avoiding a conflict, or even seeing a little bit of drama or blaming in their approach. The S style tends to focus on feelings and consensus. So in many cases, it's not uncommon to see them with that overly agreeable style either withdraw or cave in to what other people want or need, putting their own needs last. And with that conscientiousness style, their focus is on justice and logic, which can cause them to be argumentative or even defensive in conflict. So it's an overview of DISC. It can give us a lens into how people respond in conflict. So my question for you now is, what's important to you in conflict? Right? Everybody has a different priority when it comes to conflict. What's important for you? Is it being expressive? Is it being logical? Is it maybe avoiding it? Is it winning or getting the right results? Take a moment to reflect on that. And also what drains your energy during conflict. Some people love it, thrive on it. It's part of how they grew up, and it's a meaningful process that they think is important. And by the way, it is. We just want to make sure it's productive. For you, what drains your energy? Take a moment to respond to those two questions. Pop something into the chat box. So what's important to you during conflict? And how do you think your style, what drains your style, what drains your energy during conflict? For me personally, I know that it's important for me to have a collaborative approach. I want to get things out on the table, and drama absolutely drives me nuts, or when people don't go directly to each other. So what's showing up for you? What's important to you during conflict? What drains your energy? Take another 20 seconds or so to reflect on that and put a response into your chat box. Finding the course and results that work. Draining for this person is personal drama. Yeah, great example. Absolutely. For somebody else, it's important to be acknowledged. So expression, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You want to be heard, want to be acknowledged. What drains your energy is someone who won't listen, only wants to be right and isn't flexible. Yeah, there's a huge cost to that. For somebody else, preserving relationships is important and giving everybody an opportunity to speak. What's draining is rehashing the same points over and over again. Yeah, I can hear the frustration in that. If someone else says, hey, focusing on facts and analysis and outcome is important. So you can hear, like, these are all really different approaches to conflict. None are right or wrong. And I think that's part of what's important here, is that they're just different. And part of what we have to figure out if we want to be an effective team is, how do we acknowledge that and adapt to that? So part of the process here is understanding how we respond naturally in conflict, and what are the productive tendencies that we have. And then when those are overused, or maybe when things get tense and we slip emotionally, where is there some destructive tendencies? So if we look at the dominant style, so folks that maybe are more results oriented in their priority, typically they productively come to the table with straightforward opinions, acknowledging tough issues, willingness to have objective discussions and debates. Very productive response in conflict. Where they can go wrong is when they sort of are insensitive or impatient, or that desire to win gets so strong that it creates win-lose situations, or where they refuse to bend, or maybe even overpower people. So that's the dominance tendencies. The influence style, again, that friendly, cooperative, expressive, charming, outgoing style. Oftentimes productively, they'll communicate with empathy. They're encouraging that dialogue. They provide reassurance to others. They're verbalizing their emotions, all very healthy. When those are overused, you can see some overly emotional responses, or maybe talking over people. Sometimes there's a spontaneity or an impulsiveness that can happen and then result in a personal attack. The steadiness style, again, that accepting and agreeable team player style, will show flexibility. So we often see some very productive tendencies here, where they're looking out for other people's feelings. They're inclusive in their approach. They communicate tactfully. They listen well. They maintain composure. Their style can become destructive, if you will, when they give in, like that overly accepting tendency, where they become too complying. And oftentimes it's out of a need to please others. And then the conscientiousness style, looking for the root cause, trying to dig deeper, find out what the issues are, and even giving space. Those are all very productive responses in conflict. The overuse is the defensiveness that might come out of the passive aggressive tendencies, where there's maybe an initial desire to not engage in conflict, and then a strong response with a logical and over-analysis approach. So each of these styles comes to the table with some strong productive tendencies. The question is, and the challenge for you is, what are your tendencies in conflict where maybe it can go wrong when things get tense? So reflect on a time. We're going to use this example, by the way, a couple times today. Reflect on a time, maybe a recent example of a conflict that occurred. It could have been, something that's happened in the workplace, a disagreement with your manager, or a disagreement with someone on your team on how to proceed forward. It doesn't have to be about conflict because of different personalities, but because of business decisions that you're trying to make. Reflect on a time when you used a destructive behavior during conflict. What was the outcome for you? And how could it have been different if you'd used productive behavior? So take a minute, put something in the chat box. What was an example of a recent conflict where maybe you slipped from that productive response to a more destructive response? What was the outcome? How could it have been different if you'd used a different approach? Take a minute to respond to those two questions. So right now we're still sort of in that self-awareness where we're looking at our natural tendencies in conflict. We've looked at our nurturing, if you will, how we were brought up. Now we're looking at personality and what some of our tendencies might be just because of who we are as a person. When you use that destructive behavior, what was the outcome? How could it have been different if you maybe had a different approach? For me, a tendency is to be a little bit overly hands-off in a situation. And then I'll come back and be critical. And so that's a tendency that I have to watch out for. And I think what it does is it shuts down the conversation, doesn't support the team in moving forward. So those are my development areas that I'm always working on. For others, the impact could be that you could have moved faster, or you could have been more cohesive as a team, or maybe even come up with more innovative ideas. So the first step is really around self-awareness. What's your style? How does your nature impact how you show up in conflict when things get tense? And that's important, but it's not sufficient, right? When we think about emotional intelligence, the first piece is self-awareness. That's great, and that's important. We need to build that. But the second piece is really around self-regulation. It's like, now that you know how you respond in a certain situation, can you then control and create a more effective response later on? And so that's what Ruby here, back to our project team, is starting to realize. She knows how she responds, and she realizes that now she needs to recognize what's triggering those behaviors, and instead of having a destructive outcome, how can you create a productive response? So let's take an example. Back to this team. So Ruby's team has a project deadline. Ruby came up with a plan. She presented her plan to the team. She's ready to implement it so that they can now meet their deadline. But Dave, remember, Dave is the guy to the right of Ruby, and he's got that logical, conscientious approach, and he's concerned with some of the logistics and details around Ruby's plan. And Ruby didn't think the team had time to consider all of these details. And she's expressed some impatience to move forward and get this thing done. Dave wants to ensure that the team is on top of it, that they've got the right plan in place before moving forward. And he was a little bit critical of Ruby's plan. Ruby dismissed his opinions. She became defensive and walked out of the meeting saying they were going to do it her way anyways because it was the best plan. So that's the situation, right? That's the conflict incident that's at hand. So remember, part of what we're trying to do here is not just teach a 4-step process for conflict resolution. What we're trying to do is build the capacity of people, of team members, of leaders, so that we can be more effective in any given situation. So one tool for expanding that capacity is the cognitive behavior approach, which is a proven psychological methodology. So we've got a conflict situation, and then we've got a response that happens. So what this approach allows us to do is to think about our thoughts that may be generating some feelings which might be contributing to a response. So again, we can build that self-awareness in that capacity. So if we take Dave, remember Dave's that C style, he's experienced the conflict situation with Ruby, and one of the thoughts that Dave has, so the conflict situation was about the project plan. Dave saw some holes in it, right? And he's challenging Ruby a bit about it. One of the thoughts that he has is, hey, if this situation gets heated, it's going to be awful. So for Dave, he's feeling some anxiety, right? We had the conflict situation. He has a thought. His feeling is around anxiety, and his response is to withdraw. As the conversation continues later in that same meeting, his thoughts begin to change. I can wear this person down with superior logic. His feelings change from anxiety to defiance, and the result that he experiences is that he starts to overpower in that conflict situation. All right, so that's one example of what happens in this cognitive behavior approach. We've got a conflict situation, thoughts come up, we prioritize those thoughts based on feelings that we have, and then we have some kind of response. Let's take a look at Ron. Now remember, Ron tends to prioritize things differently than Dave. Dave prioritizes things based on logic, based on an analytical approach. Ron tends to prioritize things based on expressiveness, being accepted. Remember, he wants to be liked. So in a conflict situation, Ron might have an initial thought of, hey, you don't care about me, right? He's personalizing the conflict. He has a feeling of being undervalued, and his response is to create drama. Or as maybe the conflict situation continues, again, he personalizes it even more. They're making me out to be the bad guy. He's feeling an emotion of being insecure, and it results in an unproductive conflict behavior of gossip, right? So we've got the conflict situation, an automatic thought comes up, it generates a feeling, and it creates an outcome. Again, we're trying to create some more capacity as leaders. So for you, what was an automatic thought that you've had as you've experienced conflict? We all have them, by the way. And the idea is not to get rid of these automatic thoughts. It's to become aware of them as a first step. So what was an automatic thought that's impacted your response? Go back to that same conflict example you just thought about when I asked you to reflect on maybe a recent situation where you had some destructive patterns in that conflict scenario. What was an automatic thought that you had? Take a minute to reflect on that. And if you want, go ahead and write it down in the chat box. Again, each of these styles and our background contributes to this, impact what we prioritize, and what we prioritize impacts those thoughts and then the reactions that can happen. So now that Ruby understands her automatic thoughts, the next question for her is, how does she change how she responds in conflict, right? So great leaders can do this in the moment. Good leaders do it after the fact. Like they've got the incident, they have that meeting with their team. After the fact, they reflect on the meeting, and then they realize, oh, wait a second, I wasn't so productive when I interacted with Dave. That's good, but it's not great. And great leaders can do that in the moment and change their behaviors on the fly, right? That's the emotional intelligence that we expect from leaders. And as you rise to higher levels of leadership and you work with peers who then have competing priorities with you, it becomes more and more critical to develop that capacity so that you can stay in conversation and move that conversation forward. So how do we do this, right? So we've had this conflict. We have that automatic thought. Maybe that initial automatic thought is limiting. Maybe there's some assumptions behind it that we've got, but it's creating an unproductive response. So the first step is to first step back. The second step is to reframe the message or the automatic thought that you're having so that we can ultimately create a more productive response. So let's watch Ruby go through this. She's got this conflict situation. It's about the project plan. Dave is challenging her. Her initial automatic thought is, you have no idea what you're talking about. I've developed this plan. I know exactly what's going on. There's a feeling of defiance, and it could result in her being more argumentative, right? But for Ruby, she's going to step back. She's going to acknowledge the thought, reframe what she's thinking. Oh, okay, well, he may have a different perspective. I need to listen. It creates an emotion or a feeling of being more open-minded, and then her more productive response is to listen, right? So that's the process. One, we've got a conflict. Number two, we recognize the automatic thought that's happening. Again, we're not trying to eliminate those automatic thoughts. We all have them. It's part of being a human being. But the key is, what do you do with it? So the first step is to step back. Now, the million-dollar question is, how do I step back when things get heated and there's a lot of emotion? Well, part of stepping back is just acknowledging the emotions that come up. And of course, our emotions can be very helpful. In conflict, they can often cloud our judgment and even prevent us from making the best choices. So what we often see in conflict is that many of the emotions that come up really fall into two broad categories: anger and anxiety. And those strong emotions might be one reason why it's hard to step back. I just had a little argument with my wife last night about something that was happening. And it brought up a lot of frustration for me personally, because what we had been talking about, I had been implementing, or at least I thought I was implementing. And so that emotion, when it gets too strong, can get in the way. And the destructive process that can happen is when I don't listen, or when I override what she says or interrupt. So the key is to be aware of those strong emotions and then step back. One way to step back is to create some space. You might create a space by simply asking a question. Sometimes we just need a few seconds before that automatic thought triggers an automatic response. Or by simply saying, tell me more. Buy yourself a little bit of time to bring those emotions down, to allow you to step back, so that you can then get into the ability to reframe. Now remember, great leaders do this in the moment, not after the fact. It's easy, or it's easier to do it after the fact, but we've got to develop the capacity and the ability to do it in the moment when things are tense, chaotic and complex. So the first step is to step back. The second step is to then reframe. Like, your work's not done just by stepping back. We still now need to reframe the thought so we can have a more productive response. And one way to reframe is to ask yourself some questions. And these three questions tend to be particularly helpful. Number one, is the automatic thought that I'm having actually true? In many cases, it's not. I'm making an assumption based on what I prioritize. Maybe it's not about me. Maybe I shouldn't be personalizing it. Maybe it's not because he or she doesn't like me or doesn't think I'm competent at all. The second question, am I overreacting or exaggerating? What am I doing here to blow this thing out of proportion? And number three, is there another way to look at this? So is this a thought that is true? Am I overreacting, maybe exaggerating? Is there some hyperbole that's going on here? And is there another way to look at this, right? So that's the reframe step, so that ultimately you can get to the productive response. So what we're trying to build today is more capacity to understand our own personal background as it relates to conflict. Where did we grow up? What was the impact of that environment, both geographically as well as our home environment? And even our culture. And then two, what are your natural tendencies with your personality style? What drives you? What's important to you in conflict? What drains your energy? Understanding all of that so that you can then step back, consider the emotions, the anger or anxiety that might be coming into play, reframe how you're seeing things. What's true or not true? Am I exaggerating? Is there another way to see what's happening? And then utilize a productive response. So that's the approach that we're really trying to get to today. So I'm going to take a moment here and take everyone off mute. And thanks for listening to the conversation today. Let's have some more conversation about any questions you might have or comments you might have. What's coming up for you as you heard that approach to individuals creating more productive conflict? So everybody's off mute right now. Questions?
I'll send them all to Jill and to Brittany and to Nate and to Michael and their supervisors. I mean, it's good training stuff. So that's cool. Is that a capture tool that you have for
questions?
It's just
I'm gonna mute everybody again.
That's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. Yeah.
And if you've got a comment, I'll open it up for about a minute or so. Unmute yourself, and would love to hear from you. All right. So Imagine the possibilities. Our intent today was really to see beyond the traditional conflict resolution approach and to think about productive conflict. And if your team is getting bogged down in destructive conflict, if it's slow to make decisions, if it's slow to get committed and you're noticing that meeting after the meeting, we can help. There's a better way. And I want to take 30 seconds to just introduce our productive conflict workshop, because we think we can make an immediate impact pretty quickly. We utilize the Everything Disc Productive Conflict Profile. It's a personalized profile, about 22 pages, that really helps you understand your tendencies in conflict and to come up with some strategies to be more effective. The session it's only 4 hours, so we can do a lot in a short period of time, where we help people discover how they respond to conflict, how others respond, and how they might connect those automatic thoughts to productive conflict behaviors. So we're going to go into more detail on some of the topics that we talked about. We'll spend time talking about how you behave in conflict, recognizing maybe some of those destructive tendencies that we've all got. I shared some of my own today on this call. And then some strategies for changing your response to conflict. And then part of what we also do that's unique, I think, is we've got some follow-up tools, including our Coach Metrics technology that allows us to measure behavior change and ultimately make that learning stick. So if you're interested, we're also throwing in a 90-minute productive conflict coaching session to really accelerate the change that your team might need. We'd love to hear from you. You can email us directly at info@512solutions.com. For folks that have joined this masterclass today, thanks. And we think that additional coaching session is really going to be very helpful. Thank you all so much for joining me today. Keep an eye out. We've got more blog posts on productive conflict coming out around mid-August. We're going to have another masterclass in the September time period focused on teams in conflict. And again, our intent is to help your teams move faster, be more innovative, and help you create a great place to work. Thanks everyone for joining me, and I look forward to staying in touch.